I want to thank you for the opportunity to chat with you this morning. I have a hunch this is probably going to be a radically different kind of sermon for you than you're accustomed to. But by the end of this, I hope that you will be able to say that there was something valuable and positive that has come from it. I've taught at Harding for 24 years, but prior to that, I was in full-time ministry for 25 years. And as I was transitioning from full-time ministry into the academic element, my focus in the academic world is biblical archaeology. And my doctorate is in biblical archaeology from the University of Arizona. And so a lot of people would comment about the value of archaeology in relationships to biblical studies. And so that's what I want to chat with you about this morning. How do these two relate to each other? I do not approach biblical archaeology from the standpoint of proving the Bible. Now, that said, there are a lot of things that we find in archaeology that do demonstrate the veracity of Scripture. But I find the discipline to be much more rich and much more meaningful in helping us better to understand what's going on in the biblical world. Obviously, we're removed from those events by several thousand years, depending on the time frame that we're looking at, Old Testament, New Testament. Clearly, we're removed from those events by thousands of miles. And there's been a rather significant cultural change that has taken place within which all of us live today. And it's easy for people, and especially in that local ministry setting, as I was working, particularly in Southern California and Arizona, for people to say, well, the Bible is just an old antiquated book. What can it say to us today? We're so sophisticated, we're so modern, we're so progressed, and so forth and so on, that the antiquity and age of that has no relevance to us today at all. Well, one of the things that I did not expect as I went into the academic study of archaeology was how much people are still the same. Now, we've changed somewhat how we do things, and I'll come back to that at the end. But what I want to do this morning is to look briefly at some different categories of things that the Bible has helped us better to understand. By the way, I have some flyers here. You probably are not aware of it, but Harding has a Museum of Biblical Archaeology now. It's been there about 3 years. And so I'm going to leave these brochures up here on the table. I realize that everybody just rushes up to Searcy at the drop of a hat. But if you ever happen to find yourself in the area of Searcy and you want something to do that's free, okay, feel free to visit the museum. It's not very big. It's nowhere even near as large. It's about maybe a fourth the size of this room, not even quite that large. So it wouldn't take long to go through it. But most of the artifacts in there are real. And there are explanations and so forth associated with them. So feel free to take one of the brochures. Now, I'm going to talk this morning, though, about archaeology from my background. Now, that's perfectly understandable. I am a preacher's kid. My dad was a preacher. I grew up. Mom and Dad tell me that I was in church the first Sunday after I was born. I don't remember that for some reason. Maybe it was like Mike talked about. I started early with the Alzheimer's thing. But so I've been exposed to this literally all my life. And I was born in Tennessee, and when I was about 10, we moved out west. So some of what I'm going to talk about is my perspective of things as a youngster growing up, partly from the perspective of living here in the United States, because we have a tendency as we read Scripture to impose definitions of words and culture and traditions from the standpoint of what we experience. And one of the things that archaeology will do is it will sort of break some of those loose and give us a more, if you will, objective reality of what really went on. So this is sort of where we're going to be going here. So as we think in terms of this, okay, did I hit the wrong one? Is this, no, that's the pointer. Okay, this is not moving. I have it on. Obviously it's on the pointer. There we are. Did you do that or did I do that? Okay. That helps to know. So I may have to say next, but we'll give this another try as this unfolds. First, I want to talk about some customs of the biblical world. And these customs, okay, was that you or me? Are you pointing at me? I can't quite tell. All right, I hit the wrong button. There we are. Okay. I have always had an interest in history, which, being an archaeologist, that sort of makes sense. And I remember driving down the road, and you all have seen these, historical marker ahead. I don't know how often you stop to those things, but I've always been somebody who's very interested in what's going on. I would like to stop and read those. I'll admit I don't read anywhere near all of them, but nonetheless, it always piques my interest. And the Bible will talk about, do not remove the ancient landmarks. And when I would read the ancient landmarks, I would think in terms of historical markers. Don't take down those historical marker signs. Well, typical of so many mistakes, it was mine. My misunderstanding of what was going on. When the Bible talks about ancient landmarks, it's not historical markers at all. And what you're looking at here is an example of this. Now, people in the ancient world typically would live in town, and they would go out into the fields to work in the day, and then they would come back into town. Now, this is exactly what's going on in the book of Ruth. And the ancient landmarks were those stones that were used to demarcate and signify separation of property lines. And so God is basically telling the children of Israel, don't go around messing with the property lines. You're messing up the survey marks. Now, when you and I buy property today, one of the things inevitably that will happen is somebody will come out and measure and lay out the survey marks to make sure that you're getting all the property that you're paying for, and you're not going to be taxed more than you should be, we hope. And so the property lines are very, very important. But God is concerned here not so much about taxation as it is about issues of orphans and widows where people might encroach and dishonestly then begin to take over someone else's property. Now, if you remember in the book of Ruth, when Ruth comes back with Naomi, she gets to Bethlehem, and the Bible says in chapter 2, she goes out into the field to glean, and she goes to that part of the field that belonged to Boaz. And so what we're looking at here is sort of that kind of situation. These are pictures from Israel. And the little line of stones that you see here is the boundary between one person's field and another person's field. And sometimes these are just sort of an occasional stone lined up across the field, sort of a dotted line kind of thing. Clearly you can look at this and recognize this is not a fence to keep animals in. I mean, animals can get over this easily. It's only about this tall anyway. And so it is not a pin at all. It is a property demarcation. So, say for instance, here is, this is Jaime Thudpucker's field. Okay, he's my imaginary friend, as opposed to Harvey, the invisible rabbit. Here's Jaime's field, and this one would be Boaz's. And so she happened to go to that field rather than the one next door. And this is what the Bible's talking about when it is discussing the ancient landmarks. And so God is seeking to protect the property rights, in particular of widows and orphans. Now, if you begin to look at a concordance search of widows and orphans scattered through the Old Testament, you'll see that this is sort of part of what's going on here. God is concerned about their well-being. And so God is giving this strict prohibition. And one of them is interesting in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses tells the children of Israel, when you go into the land of Canaan, go to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, split into two parts, half of the tribes on one mountain, half of the tribes on the other, and then there will be these pronouncements, these curses. Cursed be he who lies with another man's wife, and all the congregation shall say amen. And cursed be he who steals, and so forth and so on. And one of the things is, cursed be he who moves the ancient landmarks. And when you look at this within the context of the other kinds of things, you get the impression God is really serious about this. So as you go to Israel and begin to look at some of these things, it becomes clear that this is something very important. And so I had to change my understanding of what an ancient landmark was to conform to what God had in mind rather than my imposition on what I thought it ought to be. Now, another discussion that takes place in the book of Isaiah and the book of Matthew. In both of these, there's a parable that is set up. One of them is Jesus telling it. I think it's Matthew 22. And the other one is Isaiah chapter 5. And God will talk about a man who buys a field and he clears it of stones and he builds a hedge around the field, which is, in this case, to demarcate it from someone else's, and he will build a tower within it. And what you're looking at here is an example of this terracing that tends to characterize ancient Israel. And so the walls are holding back the soil, but they're also sometimes, one property versus another. But you'll look at the left-hand middle part of the picture, there is a tower that is there. Now again, when I would read these stories as a child, I would read them and think in terms of fire watchtowers, particularly in Tennessee and I guess in Arkansas too. We would drive around and we would see these, fire watchtower, and I always wanted to go climb one of those things. I never did. Okay, but I always wanted to go climb one of those things. And so when I would read in the Bible about a man building a watchtower, I would think in terms of a fire tower, getting up there, watching out for the fires that might take place and so forth. Oh, that's not what these are for. The watchtower here is for harvest time. At harvest time, when the crops are about to be harvested, they would post somebody up there in the watchtower to make sure nobody will steal the crops. Now, my son-in-law used to raise alfalfa, and we would visit from time to time while the harvest for the alfalfa was going on. This is Southern California, and he was really concerned about somebody stealing bales of hay. And I understand that. I'm not knocking that. And so he would post somebody out there to protect his income, his revenue. And that's what these watchtowers are for. So again, I had to adjust my thinking. I was reading the text, misunderstanding it, because I was imposing on it my understanding rather than allowing God to tell me what he had in mind. And so this is one of the things that's happened with archaeology for me. Now the Bible will also talk about threshing sledges. Now those of you who are younger, and in this case I have to include myself because I was largely born and raised within a city kind of context, not a country. I'm familiar with country life somewhat, but city life, so we would go down and we would buy the loaves of bread, off the shelf kind of stuff. But a lot of people, even up until fairly recently, would raise their own grain, they would grind it, and so forth. And I've seen Sharon, my wife, has gotten raw grain and ground it up and baked bread and all that kind of stuff. It's great stuff. But in the ancient world, even up until fairly recently, that's not the way people function. They would have to raise their grain, their wheat, and then they would thresh it. And then they would winnow it. And what you're looking at in the picture here is a threshing sledge standing up on end. And it consists of 3 boards that are about this tall, or this long, I should say, but this standing on edge is about this tall. And in the bottom of it, the boards are curved up at the end, sort of like a ski. And in the bottom of it, there are holes that have been drilled, and they've pounded flint into this. And the next picture shows how the threshing sledge was used. The grain would be laid out all over the threshing floor, and then they would drag this threshing sledge all over this, and the flint on the bottom would be breaking the chaff away from the grain kernels. Now, at the end of this, you've got a mess. Now, I eat grape nuts almost every morning, okay? I love grape nuts. I don't know why. But I just love grape nuts. I could exist on grape nuts every morning for breakfast and be perfectly content. My wife doesn't understand this, but that's fine. But I know that a lot of times when people eat cereal, there'll be a little piece of grass floating in it. People freak out over this. I've sort of gotten past it. I've been on excavations and, all kinds of weird junks come up in our food. So I just eat the little piece of grass that's sitting there. But a lot of people freak out over a floating piece of grass. Well, that's sort of what you have here. When the threshing sledge is done, this is all a big mix. And the threshing process is brutal to the grain. Not the grain kernels, but to the stalk and everything else. So what they have to do is come along and winnow it. And this is the winnowing process. So they would gather this up into a pile. They'd take a fork or a shovel and jam it in here and throw it up in the air on a windy day. The wind would blow the lighter stalk pieces away. And then the grain, being heavier, would fall back to the ground. And they do this over and over and over and over and over and over again. I could keep going that way, but it's going to take a long time until they don't really see any dust blowing away. And then they're going to gather the grain up and put it in storage bins. John alludes to this. John the Baptist alludes to this, that Jesus is going to come. He doesn't mention specifically Jesus. Someone's going to come along, and he's going to gather the grain into his barn, and the chaff will be burned with unquenchable fire. People in the ancient world would readily understand this. And this chaff has a flashpoint that is so quick. You've occasionally heard of grain silos exploding, and it's this chaff that is in the atmosphere, and a little spark comes, and it just blows up. For a long time, I never understood why that happened, but now I do. But this is the kind of world in which the people lived. Now, we come back again now to the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, Naomi urges Ruth, you need to get married. Okay, I'm paraphrasing dramatically here. Naomi says, you really need to get married, Ruth. And there's this dude, Boaz, who is a suitable candidate. And go down to the threshing floor and basically propose to him. I mean, that's sort of what's going to happen. And Boaz, interestingly, the wheat season is ended, and he is there, and he's going to spend the night at the threshing floor. They've done all the winnowing. The grain is heaped up similar to what you see here. This is from Gibeon. And he has nestled down. I picture him sort of throwing a blanket down and nestling down and making the edge of this his mattress, sort of a select number mattress. You nestle in here. And he goes off to sleep, and Ruth comes up, and she's going to open the negotiations for marriage with Boaz. But it's the scene similar to this where that would have taken place. Now, the reason he's spending the night there is, rather than a watchtower, he's staying overnight to protect his crop. And Ruth comes, and of course they establish and negotiate satisfactorily a wedding, and everything unfolds from that point. But this is the kind of scene that is under consideration here. As I was leaving the threshing floor there, driving down the way at Gibeon, I noticed this house that is there that had, and if you look carefully, let me see which one it is. The low wall around the perimeter, and then there's something drying on top of it. I immediately thought of Rahab and the story of the spies in the city of Jericho. But what was more fascinating to me was the little low wall. Interestingly, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is legislation that God has. When you build a house, you shall put a low parapet or wall around the perimeter of the house, the roof, so people won't fall off. Now, they use their roofs for all kinds of things. Rahab, of course, uses it to dry her flax. Here, these people are storing something up there, drying something up there. People would sleep on the roof. You remember in the book of Acts, Peter goes to the roof to pray. All of these roofs are flat. They don't work well in Arkansas. Okay, but all these roofs are flat. And what you have in Deuteronomy is a building code. When you build a house, put the little wall around the perimeter so nobody fall off. So it's a liability factor. Not a whole lot's changed here. Now, I don't know what happens. Was there a building inspector that would come along and check and penalize them if they didn't? I don't know. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. But nonetheless, you still have an implied element of a liability factor and a building code implicit within this law. Now, moving to technology in the ancient world. First item I want to consider here is water supply. Now, in Israel, it does not rain like it does in Arkansas. Okay. And the rain season is very distinct from basically the beginning of March to middle end of October. The other way around. From the beginning of October to the middle end of March is when it rains, and then the summertime it's almost non-existent. So you've got to have some access to a water supply. And so most of these towns ideally would have either be by a river or a stream or a spring. The problem with springs is that they're at the bottom usually of the hill. And therefore they're vulnerable. You want to build your city on top of an elevation for defensive purposes, but the spring is usually outside of the city wall. So you got to go there. And the Bible will talk a few occasions about individuals going outside the city to get their water. There's a narration in the book of Genesis as well as in Samuel about people going outside to get the water. So what we're looking at here is a water system. There are going to be two of them here at Gibeon. All right. Now, I want to start with the picture up in the upper left-hand corner. This section here is a drawing, a top plan of the city wall. All right. This is the outside of the city. This is the inside of the city. The spring is there. So the spring is outside the city. Now, in time of war, it's going to create a problem. You know, the enemy are out there surrounding your town. You got to have water. You go outside, blip, you're done. Okay. Keel over with an arrow or a sling stone or something like that. So, one of the ingenious things that they often would do is they would dig, in this case, a tunnel. And the tunnel begins inside the city, and this is the entrance of the tunnel at the water system at Gibeon. Here I am, this is my wife standing here inside the tunnel, and the steps here, this dates from around 1050 BC. Okay, so about the time of David. And so the steps are original, and finally you get down the steps, and here is the water supply. You fill up your water jar, you go back through this tunnel to the interior of the city, protected all the while. Now, originally, the opening that you see there was blocked over so the enemy couldn't get to it. So they couldn't sabotage your water supply. So this is the water system that we had at a later period at Gibeon. Now, the earlier one is, in a sense, fascinating as well. Same map that we're looking at. There's the city wall. That's the outside of the city. This is the inside of the city. And it's this big circle that we're looking at here. And the big circle is this pit that you're looking at. Here's the top, and it goes down. There's a staircase that goes around the perimeter of it, eventually down to the water table. This is about 80 feet. So that'd be, what, a 7-story building? I mean, it's quite a distance to go down a flight of steps. And here are the steps, in actuality. And there I am, standing on this little platform. This is the drawing, of course. There I am, standing on the platform. Now, this water system is alluded to twice in the Bible. One time is when Saul has died, and the remnant of Saul's army is there, and David's army is there, and they come together. They're at the pool of Gibeon. And 12 from Saul's army and 12 from David's army are going to hand-to-hand, or well, one-on-one kind of combat, in this case 12-on-12 combat. And they basically all kill each other. And probably it's on that platform where that battle takes place. The scene is also referred to as a geographic reference point in the book of Jeremiah. But when you talk about the pool of Gibeon, probably most of us would think in terms of a pond. This is not what this is. This is a water supply. And then the blood would be dripping down and polluting the water supply, the water table, and all that kind of stuff as the thing unfolds. But the technology of digging through this without blasting caps and dynamite and so forth, you can imagine, is pretty significant. Now, the artistry of the ancient world is also profound. Now, most all of you have been to some museum and looked at the antiquities, whether Native American or Egyptian or whatever, and are often impressed with the artistry. But you have to remember, these things are done without the mechanical tools that we have available today. They didn't have electric saws. They didn't have Dremel tools. They didn't have electric drills. They didn't have electric lathes. They did have manual versions of essentially all of those, though. And most of us have seen some really, really fine handmade artwork. So on a certain level, this doesn't really overly impress us, except when you stop and think about the time consumption involved. But there's another feature of this I want to point out. As you look at this little ivory piece here, see the little tab at the top, and there's a little tab at the bottom? Sometimes these are found with letters on them. Ancient letters, like the letter equivalent A at the top and B at the bottom. Now, where does that take you? It's sort of like unfinished furniture. You have to put it together. You go to Walmart, you buy it in a box, and all you need is a crescent wrench and a screwdriver, and follow the directions. Put slot A or tab A into slot A, put tab B into slot B, put it together and tighten it up and all that kind of stuff. Now, I don't know that there were wall Davids in the ancient world, but the impression here is that there's a certain consistency of construction techniques that characterize the people in the ancient world. And I find this to be sort of an interesting corroboration of, there's a sense in which people aren't a whole lot different. Now, the next picture is really, really surprising. These pieces both date from around 3200 BC. And when they were first discovered in the 1970s, the archaeologists, when they first looked at this, thought, well, these are implements from the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Romans, sort of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were taken from Qumran, hidden in caves and so forth. These were found in caves, and these are fairly elegant pieces, and they look like bronze, and so this must be stuff that was squirreled away by the priests from Jerusalem, waiting for eventually the departure of the Romans to retrieve them and take them back to the temple. But 3200 BC well predates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. One of the reasons they look like bronze is because, now catch this, 3200 BC, all right, I mean that's a long time ago. And the reason it looked like bronze was not because it was bronze. This was copper tempered with arsenic. 2 to 12% arsenic. Oh, wow. Now, who was the bright bird that came up with that idea? Let's throw a little arsenic in here and see what happens. But in the process, it made the copper more moldable and malleable for making stuff. Now, another feature that is really surprising is these are cast made, they're sort of a lost wax method, and in the process, I keep having to look which button I'm pushing. These parts were all made separate and attached to it, but they were welded to it. Now, when I say welded here, I'm defining that as using the same kind of material to melt the pieces together, as opposed to soldering, which uses an independent source as sort of a bonding agent, sort of a metal glue, all right? But to be welding metals together in 3200 BC, I mean, that's technologically very sophisticated and very impressive. Some other technology. These are some sewer pipes from the city of Hazor, 1800 BC. Now, we don't tend to think in terms of sewer pipes that early. Now, in all fairness, not all ancient towns had sewer pipes, okay? Most of the time, the garbage flowed down the street. They just dump it out, sort of like your European kind of views that you watch in some of the movies, just dump it out the upper story and let it flow down the street. Most of the towns were like that, but some of them had sewer pipes. But as you look at the sewer pipe, these are made out of clay. They're about this long. They're tapered in on one end, and so that tapered end will slip into the end of the broader end of the other one, just like sewer pipes now. Although we use plastic ones now. Now, for a long time, they were clay until some bright person came up with that weird asphalt kind of sewer pipe that everybody who has it eventually has to replace it and curses the person who invented that stuff. But technology has not shifted here at all. Now, at Tel Bet Shemesh, where I excavate, and by the way, I'm field director of the project, we found a cistern. Now, this is the entrance into the cistern system, and these are the flight of steps going down, and then you make a right-hand turn and go to the interior. But the cutaway view of this is there's the flight of steps. You come down, and it's in the form of a cross. Now, there's nothing symbolic here. We don't think it's anything symbolic, but this is to allow a larger capacity. But what was particularly interesting, this is a cistern that was dug about 950 BC, right in the middle of Solomon's reign, and was used until about 635 BC, and then the Assyrians shut it down and buried it. And we did not know about it until our excavation, and we found it. This picture on the right-hand side is some of the plaster that still is on the walls. Plaster, mind you. I've lived in a house that had plaster walls. They don't last 2,300 years. that plaster will fall off. And what I find interesting is they had the technology to put plaster on a wall, and after 2,600 years, it's still on the walls. Why can't we do that? I think some of it's designed obsolescence. But anyway, again, the technology is impressive as we look at this. And then there's surgery in the ancient world. This is trephination. This is from the 7th century BC. Somebody has a headache. Yeah, I guess. And this is the back of a skull. It's about right here on the skull. And somebody has a headache, and so they decide they want, I'm not suggesting there's a really good diagnosis here, okay? But they decide, I want to get rid of my headache, and so they'll cut the little flap of skin, fold it back, and you can see the little saw marks. And that's what the little ridges are, where they've cut this and removed the part of the skull. And we have skulls that show evidences of these people surviving sometimes, many times. And we know that because the bone starts to grow back and it closes up. This person didn't survive very long. But, the fact that they were able to survive some of these things is impressive in and of itself. Now, that raises an interesting question. You don't want to be awake for this. I mean, you want to be out if you're going to have this. And that raises sort of the interesting question, what would you take? Now, this brings up ancient trade in the ancient world. Now, you have to understand, I traveled down here yesterday from Searcy. I forget the distance. What's the distance from here to Searcy? Anybody know? I didn't really look at it. Sorry? Yeah, well, but that's not the distance. That's the time. I know it's 3 hours, but 200 some miles, I think, is something like that, in that range. Okay. In the ancient world, if you were going to go 200 miles, it would take you at least 10 days. Usually longer. I did it in 3 hours, 3.5. Okay. And so when you think in terms of ancient trade, you're still talking about thousands of miles. The people know about a product somewhere over there. You know for a fact, not everywhere in the world has gold. You can't just go dig in your backyard and there's gold. You can't go just dig in your backyard and there's silver. Now, you can dig in your backyard here and find diamonds. Okay, but that's weird. Okay, not in your backyard, but anyway. But diamonds are not everywhere. Copper's not everywhere. Hardly anywhere has everything that you need. Usually there is something that you need that requires some communication, some contact, some exchange, and so forth. And when we're talking about trade in the ancient world, we're talking about potentially thousands of miles and the time consumption involved in order to make that distance. Now, I have with me, the little vessels that you're looking at here are known as bills. I have one here. And this is 1350 BC. Please don't touch it. Okay. But 1350 BC, I can touch it, it's mine. Okay. But 1350 BC. And this is the size of these vessels up here. And these became trade vessels. Now, the next picture shows some of these vessels from our site at Tel Bet Shemesh. The ones on the right are out of our excavation. But some bright person came along and said, if you take that vessel and turn it upside down, it looks like an opium poppy. So I have pictures of opium poppies up here. And somebody said, yeah, and you're smoking it too. But eventually, the archaeologists came along and were able to do residue tests in these. And sure enough, many of them do have residual opiate product. These are imported from Cyprus, where they grew opium, and these apparently were marketing ploys. So that you might not know the term that it was used, but you can tell by looking at the vessel, I want some of that. Now, if I'm going to have a trephination, give me some of this. All right. And of course, most of us who've been through surgeries and so forth have had those experiences. We want something to put us out. But again, the implied trade commodity that is under consideration here. Now, another has to do with trading in copper. This is what's known as an oxhide ingot of copper. It's about this long and about this wide, and it weighs about 60 to 70 pounds. And this is the way they would ship it. They would put it on ships, and they would hang these with the little tabs in racks on the boats to ship it from one place to another, Which, by the way, having lived in Arizona in a copper mining town, when I showed a picture like this, they all perked up and think that's almost exactly the same way we ship copper now. We'll have the big slab hanging there with the little tabs. We'll put it on freight cars and line it up and ship it off to wherever then they're going to turn it into a finished product. So this is from a shipwreck. We don't find these typically in excavations because they've been plundered in the ancient world. But when a ship goes down, most people don't find these until the archaeologists come along. Now, the site of Ekron, which is where I began my excavation, this is an olive press installation. And in this olive press, they would put the olives, whoops, wrong way, sorry. Go back. We're not going back. Can you go back for me? Sorry. We're not going back. Is it not going back there either? There. Yeah, stop there. Now, they would put the olives in that middle vat, and then they would have a big roller. They would crush the olives, and the olive would, the oil would seep out. And then they would gather that pulpy mass up and put it in sort of a burlap bag, several burlap bags, stack them up on the little round ones, and put a press over it, and then press the olive oil out. Now, the next slide, back where we were, is a reconstruction of this. There would be a wall in the back, a beam hanging out with weights on the end, and they would then press the oil into the vat and gather it up and put it into the ceramic jars and ship it off. Now, Ekron is a town, I'm trying to put it in perspective. Okay, if you go from here to the intersection down where, T-junction, if you sort of square that off, that's about the size of Ekron. So it's not a big town. All right, none of these towns are very big. It's not a big town. But this is where they would concentrate a lot of their oil production. And the estimate production was, hang on to your boots here, 1.1 million quarts of oil a year. That's a lot of oil. And all of this is produced within about a 2-month period. It's a crop, okay? And all of it's produced in about a 2-month period. I mean, this is specialization. And in the archaeological world, some of these jars, like you see on the right-hand side of this, have been found as far away as southern Spain, where the olive oil has been shipped. Now, that's a long way. It's about 2,000 miles. And the time consumed in order to get there, and the knowledge of the oil in order to be shipped. I mean, the sophistication of this is profound. Now, as we move on, okay, here's a New Testament version of olive oil installation. This is more domestic, more household. But this one also has some significance. These are two versions. It's basically the same thing. The olives we put on this platform here, this big stone rolled around here, the olives would be crushed. The oil would then drift over to the perimeter into a groove, and then they would funnel it off into jars, and then people take it home. This is, though, the kind of thing that Jesus has in mind when he's talking about the importance of faithfulness. Matthew 18. If anyone causes one of these little ones that believes on me to stumble, it would be better that a great millstone be hung around his neck and he be cast into the depths of the sea. I mean, we've all heard of concrete boots. Occasionally hear of somebody trying to get rid of a body, a concrete block, throwing them over into the lake. Those are nowhere near the size of this. But what we need to understand is the drama of Jesus' statement and how critically important. And again, this is one of those things that sort of heightens my appreciation and understanding of what Jesus is saying. And it's based upon an archaeological situation. By the way, we're nearing done. So in case you're wondering, which has got shut up. Government. Can't get away from government. Seems that's always on our case. And keep hitting that button and the pointer comes on. Okay. Here's government. These are two jars. The top shows them in situ, their original location, and then they're glued back together. But there are little pieces of silver that were in these. And on the jar, there's an inscription that says fifth. Has nothing to do with Jack Daniel. Okay. But the fifth here is basically a 20% tax rate that they've gathered up in little bits of silver. They put it in the jar, and they're waiting for the government officials to come along and pick it up. But before the government officials got there to pick it up, the city was destroyed. And so it got buried in the debris of the city for the archaeologists to come along and find. 20% tax rate, wow, that sounds fairly common in our world today. You know, again, not a whole lot's changed. Next. Here's another example of that, is in a museum, an Israel museum. Next slide. I'm going to revert to you here. Religion, and this will be essentially the last little section. In religion, go to the next slide. What you're looking at is a baptistry. The same baptistry, two different angles. This is at a site, this is from the 6th century A.D., and it's an immersion baptistry, designed in the shape of a cross, where you have a flight of steps that goes down, and so the people would walk into the baptistry on a little flight of steps, and then they would be baptized, immersed in the transverse section. Now, the reason this is really, really, I think, important, you know, there's a discussion in the religious world about, you know, how is baptism supposed to be done. Now, typically in churches of Christ, we understand immersion is the mode by which that's done. I have no fault with that. I'm fully on board with that. But this, I think, gives at least a significant archaeological corroboration of that. Because this church building in the 6th century A.D. in Palestine is in an area where the average rainfall is 4 to 6 inches of rain a year. If it was legitimate to use sprinkling or pouring as an appropriate mode of baptism, why waste the water to immerse? I hope you understood how I said that. I'm trying to be fair-minded in this. Now, on a certain level, this does not prove that it was always immersion. But when an area that has 4 to 6 inches of rain a year, I mean, they're barely squeaking by with water in the first place to live on. Why, if the other modes are legitimate, why use water in this fashion? I think it's a corroborative point. Okay, there are some other slides I'm not going to go into, but I do want to close with this. When we think in terms of archaeology, I hope that you've begun to see that archaeology, on a certain level, can sort of confirm what we've looked at, but the broader perspective is to recognize it can enrich our understanding. I will argue it rarely changes our understanding, but it's sort of like it gives it more depth. It gives it more drama. It gives it more richness. And one of the things that I think it demonstrates is there's government, there are customs, there's livelihood, there's trade connections, there's religion. All of these things have always been part of the human existence. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus talks about evil things proceeding from within and defile the heart. And then he lists a bunch of them. And as you look at them, fornication, theft, adultery, murder, envy, and so forth. Have any of those gone away? No. Not a one of them has gone away. We may change the technical way we do things, but the problem is not the technology, the problem is the heart. And that is what the Lord wants to address. And hence, I would propose and argue vehemently, this book of God's Word, even though it is 2,000 plus years old, is still relevant to our world today, just as much as it ever has been, if we're fair-minded in how we deal with what's going on. I urge you, listen to God's Word. We may have to make some technical adaptations. But when God is appealing to the heart, obey from the heart that form of doctrine. Have you done that? Have you been baptized by immersion into Christ to have your sins washed away? Raised to walk a new life. A new life with meaning and definition and hope and expectation. That's what Jesus offers us. That's what He promises us if we will come to Him in submission. If you're subject to the invitation of Jesus, we plead with you to come. Won't you come when we stand and sing?